day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." And Satan answered the Lord, saying, "Does Job fear the Lord for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the works of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now put forth your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord then said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Now on that day when the sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. And they also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another one also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." But while he was still speaking, another one also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Satan, verse 7, went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, and he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. And his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept God or good from God and not accept adversity? And yet in all this Job did not sin with his lips." Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all the adversity that had come upon him, they each came from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come and to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each one of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads towards the sky, and they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to them. They saw that his pain was very great. I want to ask you a question this morning. This may be a question that as soon as I say it, you'll instantly have a billion different answers as I say it. Let me ask you the question this morning. How do you define grief? As soon as I say the word grief, instantly probably a whole bunch of definitions come into your mind. Grief could be losing someone you love. Grief could be losing a job. Grief could be moving across the country. And grief can be a lot of different things to a lot of people. But one of the reasons that Job's story works so well to open up this topic of grief is because not only is grief defined by the actions of Job, all this loss, but it's also diversified in the book of Job. Because what Job experiences is not just his economic collapse of his house. He loses all of his possessions. He doesn't just lose his children, although in Job chapter 1 that would be devastating to anybody. He doesn't just lose those. He also, if you look in Job chapter 2, also loses his wife. Because his wife, for all intents and purposes, has completely given up on him, saying to him, "You still hold fast your integrity, but your one way out of this is to curse God and die." And it's at that point, especially by the time that Job's friends show up, that Job feels utterly alone. And I like how the text shows in Job chapter 2 that his friends look up and see him at a distance, and they don't even recognize him. And they show up and see that his grief is so great that they don't say anything for an entire week. And it seems to indicate from the text that if Job hadn't started talking in Job chapter 3, they would have kept sitting there for as long as they needed to. And so when you look at Job chapter 1 and 2, we obviously look at Job as being somebody who was just overcome by grief, but you see grief personified and diversified and defined by Job chapter 1 and chapter 2. So I ask you, how do you define grief? I like what one author had to say. Edgar Jackson had to say this about grief, and it's a little long, but I like the way he characterizes it. He says, "Grief is a young widow trying to raise her 3 children alone. Grief is the man so filled with shocked uncertainty and confusion that he strikes out at the nearest person. Grief is a mother walking daily to a nearby cemetery and staying quietly and alone a few minutes before going about the tasks of the day. She knows that part of her is in the cemetery just as a part of her is in her daily work. Grief is the silent knife-like terror and sadness that comes 100 times a day when you start to speak to someone who is no longer there. Grief is the emptiness that comes when you eat alone without saying goodnight to the one who has died. Grief is the helpless wishing that things were different when you know they are not and never will be again. Grief is like a whole cluster of adjustments, apprehensions, and uncertainties that strike life in its forward progress and make it difficult to redirect the energies of life. That's grief, ladies and gentlemen. And Webster's dictionary doesn't have anything on that, because grief is almost one of those words that defines words. Grief is not one of those things that you define as much as it's something that you feel. And Job, especially in Job chapter 1 and 2, felt grief to its utter magnitude. And I know that I'm speaking to people here this morning, ladies and gentlemen, who have experienced grief to a certain magnitude in their own life. You have buried loved ones. You have watched loved ones pass away. And you know that daily experience of loss in your life. And Job feels that. I would argue that another person that feels that is David. If you remember in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David is coming off of the heels of something that's almost completely insurmountable. Now granted, David's sin in 2 Samuel chapter 11 sets the stage for that. And it's hard to look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 and see David and feel pity for him. Because 2 Samuel chapter 11 is so heinous in the fact that he not only commits adultery with one of his own warriors' wives while he's gone, he then arranges for the murder of Uriah the Hittite and then covers up the whole thing at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 12, or 2 Samuel 11, which ends with the statement that what he did was displeasing to God. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 12, it opens up with this story that Nathan the prophet shows up to him several months after the fact and talks to him about this person who has a lamb, who has a bunch of sheep, and has a bunch of possessions, but because he didn't want to take from his own flock, he steals his neighbor's and slaughters that lamb to sacrifice or to satisfy this stranger that just happens to be passing through, this friend that just happens to be passing through. And when David rightly criticizes the man and says this person should be executed for what he does, Nathan then steps up to the plate and says, you're the person that is guilty of this. You may not have been in this exact same scenario, but you're the person that's guilty of this. And when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 15, this is when the punishment is inflicted. Nathan doles out the punishments. He talks about in verses 11 through 14. But in verse 15, it says the Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow. And notice how it mentions it as Uriah's widow. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David so that he was very sick. And David therefore inquired of God for the child, and David fasted and went and lay all night on the ground. And the elders of the household stood beside him in order to raise him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat food with them. David was in grief. And you can't skip past 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 15 through 17, regardless of what he's done up until that point, and not acknowledge the simple fact that David was overcome with sorrow. To the point that any one of us would do in that situation, where you're just on the ground and you're crying and you're fasting, to the point that nobody can console you, because words cannot take away that pain. And so regardless of what David has done up until that point, you have to acknowledge the fact that in 2 Samuel chapter 12, he is overcome with grief. But that's only one of three punishments. As Nathan has described in the verses immediately preceding that, David's punishment will not just be in one department, which is his son passing away, but he also acknowledges the fact that number two, your family is going to fight for generations. And anybody that's read the end of Samuel, has read Kings, has read Chronicles, knows that that did not go away. Because after Solomon, you have Jeroboam, you have Jeroboam II, you have Josiah, you have this whole lineage of kings that fight amongst themselves. Not to mention the fact that David has a front row seat to the whole Amnon and Tamar incident, Absalom, and then on his deathbed, he has to watch Solomon fight for the throne in 2 Kings chapter 1. And so he sees the fact that his family is going to fight. He also knows that he's going to be ashamed. When Absalom takes some of David's concubines up to the roof and defames David in front of the sight of all of Israel. And so even though David knows at this point that his son has died, that's only one of three punishments that David knows he's going to have to endure. And rather than look at David, and it's very easy to look at him and criticize him for his actions in 2 Samuel chapter 11, and I think he deserves to be criticized. I'll make the rather bold statement that David doesn't get enough credit in 2 Samuel chapter 12. David deserves all the blame, all the anger, and all the criticism in 2 Samuel chapter 11. But I would argue too that David does not get enough credit for his actions in 2 Samuel chapter 11. When you look at verse 18, for instance, if you're in 2 Samuel chapter 12, look at what happens in verse 18. In verse 18 of 2 Samuel chapter 12, it says, it happened on the seventh day. This is David's week of sorrow, very similar to Job's week of sorrow. It says it happened on the seventh day that the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, because they said, behold, while the child was alive, we spoke to him and he didn't listen to our voice. How then can we tell him that the child is dead, since he might do himself harm? Let me iterate the fact that that is a very valid concern on David's servants' part. They think he's going to commit suicide if what he fears eventually comes to pass. Verse 19, but when David saw that his servants were whispering together, he asked, or he perceived that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. David arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, changed his clothes, and he came into the house of the Lord, and he worshipped. And then he came into his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. David is a very interesting character on a whole bunch of different levels, but when you look at what he does in 2 Samuel chapter 11, it doesn't seem to compute. But in 2 Samuel chapter 12, it's almost as if the entire narrative changes, because he accepts his punishment, he mourns for his son, but did you notice what he does in verse 20? When he finds out that his son has indeed perished, he does what nobody, I would argue, in this room, or at least maybe I'm just speaking for myself, would have the strength to do. He gets up, he washes himself, he puts on his clothes, and then the fourth one, and the order of this is very important, the fourth one is he worships God. He moves on, ladies and gentlemen. He knows that this punishment comes from God. He knows that it's justly deserved because of his own sins. He knows what's happening, and yet he still manages to, ladies and gentlemen, worship God. And it's very easy to talk to somebody when they're going through an extremely grief-stricken period where the emotions are at an all-time high. And most of us will hopefully only experience one or two of those in our entire lifetime, where the grief is just so overwhelming that we almost can't even breathe. It's very easy for us to look at those people and say, well, what you need to do is you need to pray. That's what you need to do. You need to pray towards God. You need to read your Bible. You need to talk to other people. Those are the practical things. And those are the practical steps that anybody who's experiencing a period of grief in their life needs to do. But it's a completely different scenario when you find yourself in that position. And that's where I think David gets all the credit in 2 Samuel chapter 12 for the fact that after he learns that his child has passed away, he gets up, he puts on clothes, he washes himself, flip those two, and then he worships God. I think that's a powerful statement, especially when you look at the verses immediately follow that. Look in 2 Samuel chapter 12, starting in verse 21. These are the practical steps. His servant said to him, what is this thing that you have done? Because while the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But when the child died, that's when you arose and ate food. It should have been the other way around. And he says, very practically, verse 22, he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he has died. And why then should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not come back to me. David exhibits in this passage what I think is a remarkable amount of strength, or a remarkable amount of fortitude that I would wager to bet that I probably wouldn't have if that were my life. Because not only is he facing a period of incredible grief, having to watch his child pass away, but he also knows that that child has passed away as a result of his own sins. That's grief upon grief upon grief upon grief. And yet he still picks himself up. He's able, ladies and gentlemen, to move on. And that's why I think David deserves all the credit in this passage. I think you can learn some things from David. We can learn a lot of things from Job and the way that he handles his grief, but that's 40 plus chapters of dialogue. We would take us a long time to get through that. I think you can see a lot about grief by the way that David handles this period of his life. And the first, by far, the biggest one, in my opinion, is that he understands his pain is not God. He understands that pain is overwhelming, that grief is strong, and that it has the ability to almost crush you from the inside out. But he is not worshiping his pain. It's a period of hardship, to be sure. It's a period of struggle. It's a period of trouble. But it is not his God. It should not consume him. This is a lesson he needed to learn several chapters later. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 19. 2 Samuel chapter 19, after he's experiencing the second of these punishments, which is watching his family fight, he finds out at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 18 that his son Absalom, who has rebelled against him, has humiliated him in front of the sight of all Israel. He now realizes that Absalom is dead. In 2 Samuel chapter 19, starting in verse 1, it says, it was told Joab, behold, the king is weeping, and he mourns for Absalom. And you see that at the end of chapter 18. That victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. And the people went by stealth into the city that day, as people who were humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. Took that day of great victory against the coup and turned it into a period of sadness. The king almost doesn't even seem to notice. David doesn't seem to notice, because in verse 4 it says, he covered his face and he cried out with a loud voice, saying, my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, this is one of the few shining moments of Joab's life, Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your lives and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you, and by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that if princes and servants are nothing to you, for I know this day that if Absalom were alive, and yet all of us were dead, then you would be pleased. Now therefore, rise, verse 7, go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from the youth until now. David is so overcome with his grief by his son Absalom that he completely ignores the fact that the major threat to the throne of Israel has been neutralized. And not only has it been neutralized, but that neutralization came at the expense of thousands of soldiers' blood. A lot of people lost their sons that day. A lot of people lost their husbands. A lot of people lost people that they loved. And yet the only thing David could be consumed with, in 2 Samuel chapter 19, was the fact that Absalom had died. Absalom, the guy who had lost all of this stuff. And so he almost shells up. He becomes a kind of a cloister where he just doesn't even look at everything else. And he, in essence, worships his pain. That's the thing that he becomes consumed with. And I know, as I mentioned earlier, that there are people here this morning that have struggled with things and are going through a lot of grief and a lot of difficulties, and you may be at this moment. But I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that that does not define you. It's a part of you. Job is always going to be defined. It's always going to be a part. That loss is always going to be a part of his life. And I will tell you that David is always going to have this period of his son, that nameless son, if I remember right, that passed away. That is always going to be a part of his life. But it does not have to define him. And it does not have to consume him to the point that he can't think about anything else. I like how C.S. Lewis once described pain. C.S. Lewis, the great theologian of the 20th century, he defined pain as God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And I think that's true. But there's so many of us sometimes, regardless of the level of grief that we experience, that allow it to become the thing that paralyzes us, to the point that we worship it at the expense of everything else. I want you to look at Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is, as most of us are familiar with, it's the psalm that he wrote after Nathan the prophet came to him, and he was kind of facing his own sin head on. And we don't have time to go through all of this. But if you look at Psalm 51, starting in verse 12, we're going to read two verses here, as you can see from the PowerPoint behind me. If you look at Psalm 51 and verses 12 to 13, I want you to notice something David says, because it kind of flies under the radar. He says in verse 12, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me with the willing spirit." And then verse 13, "I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted to you." If you read the first 10, 11 verses, you notice that what David has asked for up until that point is a cleansing. He asks for God to cleanse his heart, to renew a steadfast spirit within him, to rid him of this sin and this transgression, get it out of his life. But if you notice, the narrative changes in verse 11, because he says, "Don't cast me away from your presence, don't take your Holy Spirit from me, and restore to me the joy of your salvation." What does David want, ladies and gentlemen, especially this later stage in Psalm 51? He wants to be reminded of the joy of God's salvation. And I would argue, too, that when you're so enthralled in your grief, and I'm so enthralled in my grief, that I can't even think straight, and all I can think about is the things that I've lost, what we need to be reminded about in those time periods is all the things we still have. The fact that we have salvation. The fact that we have the fellowship of God. The fact that we have a fellowship of Christians that can lift us up with that. David says much the same thing in Psalm 13. This Psalm 13 is written, it's only 6 verses long, so we're going to read the entire psalm. I hope that doesn't scare you. But when you look at Psalm 13, he starts off in a very gloomy face, or kind of a gloomy face, but it switches a little bit. It kind of grows, and he progresses through that. In Psalm 13 and verse 1, he says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel of my soul, having sorrowed in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me?" All of us who have gone through periods of grief understand what David is talking about. Psalm 13 verses 1 and 2 is arguably some of the most relatable passages in all the book of Psalms. But then notice how he grows in this psalm. Verse 3, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. But I," verse 5, "have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me." In the space of 6 verses, David goes from a period of grief and bitterness and possibly anger towards God to a period of experiencing joy and happiness at what God has given to him. And that's the same transformation that we need to make. When we go through periods of trial, we go through periods of struggle and insurmountable grief, we need to be reminded of what we have and ask God to restore to us the joy of our own salvation. But David also realized that there's always going to be hope in the midst of these struggles. At the end of 2 Samuel chapter 12, not at the end, but after all this, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, after the baby has passed away, there's a little bit of an interlude in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 24, where it mentions that David comforted his wife Bathsheba, went into her and lay with her, and she then gave birth to a son, and he named it Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent word throughout Jonah, Nathan the prophet, and he named him Jedediah for the Lord's sake. And what you notice in this passage, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 24 through 25, is that God was able to take this really, really dark period in David's life and turn it into something that was actually worthwhile. Because it's through the lineage of Solomon that the temple was built. It's through the lineage of Solomon that the kings descend out of. And it's through the lineage of Solomon that Jesus Christ himself comes out of. And so when we look at these dark situations in our life where we're overcome with grief, where it's just almost as if nothing can go right, we need to remember the fact that something good can still come out of it. I'm not excusing David's sin any more than Paul would say in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. Shall we continue in sin so that grace may abound? May never be. I'm not arguing that we need to sin at all. But what I am telling you is that in these darkest moments in our life, some of which may be our fault, if we cause something tragic, but in these darkest moments of our life, there can always be something good that comes out of that. You see this very plainly, for instance, in Jeremiah chapter 52. Look at that if you would. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet, and I think for good reason. As we mentioned, I think last week, he has a front row seat to the destruction of Jerusalem, which is more or less his home city. And Jeremiah 52, which would be the very end of the book of Jeremiah, you'd think it would end kind of on a whimper. It actually doesn't. Because in Jeremiah chapter 52, starting in verse 28, it says, and this is actually negative, he says, "These are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away into exile. The 7th year, 3,023 Jews. The 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 832 persons from Jerusalem. And the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, the captain of the guard, carried into exile 745 Jewish people. And there were about 4,600 persons in all." So the exile, by the time you get to Jeremiah chapter 52, is in full bloom. Everything's gone, everything's destroyed, the people are carried away. But notice how Jeremiah ends. "Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the 12th month and the 25th of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, showed favor to Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him, set his throne above the thrones of the kingdoms who were with him in Babylon. And so Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. For his allowance," verse 34, "a regular allowance was given to him by the king of Babylon, a daily portion all the days of his life until the day of his death." Jeremiah ends on a somewhat pessimistic note. You have the exile and gloom, you have people gone, you have Jerusalem destroyed, and there's a lot of people that are taken from their homelands. But if you read that last chapter carefully, especially those last 3 or 4 verses, what you come away with, ladies and gentlemen, is that Israel is destroyed, Jerusalem is in ashes, but there's still a little bit of hope. Because the king is sitting in favor with the other king, and there's at least some semblance that life may go on. And even when you look at the last chapter of the book of 2 Chronicles, if you look at the very last chapter, it ends with Cyrus's big decree about the fact that the exiles can then return back to their homeland. And so even in these books that describe destruction and annihilation and judgment, there's still a little bit of hope. And that's what we need to remember when we're in our darkest periods. The 30th Psalm, for instance, Psalm 30, starting in verse 1. I would argue once again that David knew all this. Psalm 30, starting in verse 1, sorry. I get really excited, my voice goes up an octave. Psalm 30, look at verse 1. David writes, "I will extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up. Let not my enemies rejoice over me, O Lord my God. For I cried to you for help, and you healed me. O Lord, you have brought me up from Sheol. You have kept me alive that I would not go down to the pit. Sing praise to the Lord, you his godly ones, and give thanks to his holy name." Now listen to verse 5. "For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. Flip over to Psalm 56. Psalm 56, if you're into highlighting, these two passages are perfect. Psalm 56, starting in verse 5. Psalm 56, starting in verse 5. It says, all day long they distort my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited to take my life. Because of wickedness, cast them forth. In anger, put down the peoples, O God. Verse 8 is that verse that's worth highlighting. All of it is because it's the Bible, but especially verse 8. You have taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle. Or are they not in your book? One of the hardest things whenever we're going through these periods of trial, these periods of grief, and this overwhelming sense of just suffocating sorrow. One of the hardest things to remember for all of us is the fact that God's still there. The fact that God still exists. The fact that God's still real. And yet when you look at Psalm 56 and verse 8, it says, put my tears in your bottle, because are they not written in your book? God sees those tears. He sees that sorrow. And there can still be hope coming out of that. And that's what we need to remember when we're in the midst of all of this. I find it very fitting that when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 25, the name they give Solomon. Solomon is his name that everyone remembers. But the name that they give Solomon, and the name that Nathan gives Solomon, is Jedediah, which means beloved by Jehovah. And you would think that a son that came out of this completely adulterous and completely immoral union would not have a name that signifies beloved by Jehovah. And yet here we are. Solomon is one of his names, but Jedediah shows the fact that God still views hope for the future, because ultimately, as we understand it, anyone who's been through grief understands. Life moves on. I like what Robert Frost said, the poet. I don't read poetry, but I like Robert Frost. He said, in 3 words, I can sum up everything I've learned about life. It goes on. And I don't think there's more truer statement that we can say at this point than something like that. The grief and sorrow is a funny thing. Something happens in your life where a struggle comes up, and maybe it lasts an hour, maybe it lasts a couple of years. But for whatever reason, you find yourself in this period of immense sorrow and grief. And while you're cocooned up and you're struggling with it, you're persevering and getting through that, everybody else is living their life. And so when you finally come out of this period of grief, you find that people have taken new jobs. People have bought cars. People have moved away. And you are aware of it, but you're not really conscious of it. Except for the fact that you've been so cooped up in this period of your life that we ignore sometimes the fact that life intends to move on. One of the greatest poets of the last 20th, or the 19th century was a man named Lawrence Dunbar. Lawrence Dunbar is famous for a lot of things. He was most notably, besides his literary work, was most notably one of the greatest African-American poets that came out of Civil War Reconstruction. He's the son of two former slaves. And Lawrence Dunbar wrote a lot of great things, but he died tragically around the age of 33. And his very last work, before he was stricken with his illness of tuberculosis, and then he eventually died, his very last work was placed on his desk before he eventually got up, never to sit back down again. And his mother, eventually, after Lawrence Dunbar died, was so stricken with grief that she didn't allow anybody into that room at all. She kept everything exactly how it was, even including his last poem that was sitting there on the desk. And unfortunately for Lawrence Dunbar and ultimately the world, the sun just happened to go right in through that window next to his desk. And over a period of time, it ended up bleaching that poem. And years later, after his mother would pass away, his friends would walk in, or her friends would walk in, and they would see fragments of what they thought was a beautiful poem that had been wiped away because his mother refused to move on past that night. That's understandable, I think, for all of us. When we go through periods of grief, when we go through periods of tribulation, it's very hard for us to pick up and keep moving. But David did. David eventually moved on. If we stay still and we allow grief to paralyze us, we ultimately are grieving about 2 things. Not just the past that is tough and the present that's tough, but about the future that is now lost. It's hardly ever mentioned, but if you look back at 2 Samuel chapter 12, and this is something that never gets any attention when you look at this passage. But if you look back at 2 Samuel chapter 12, there's something that happens in this story that I think is noteworthy. 2 Samuel chapter 12, flip back to that. This is after the punishment has taken place. 2 Samuel chapter 12, starting in verse 26. After Solomon has been born, in verse 24 and 25. It says in verse 26, Now Joab fought against Rabbah, the sons of Ammon, and captured the royal city. Now listen to Joab. This is another shining moment in his life. Joab sends messengers to David and says, I have fought against Rabbah. I have even captured the city of waters. Therefore, gather the rest of the people together, camp against the city and capture it, or I will capture the city myself, and it will be named after me. Joab is making a not-so-veiled threat that I'm about to take this town, I'm about to take this city, and if you don't get down here, I'm going to take it. And I'm going to take it for myself. Verse 28, I'll get all the glory for it. Verse 29, David gathered all the people and went to Rabbah, fought against it and captured it. Then he took the crown of their king from his head, and its weight was a talent of gold, and it was a precious stone, and it was placed right on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city in great amounts. He also brought out the people who were in it, set them under saws, sharp iron instruments, iron axes, and made them pass the brick. And this he did to all the cities of the sons of Ammon, and David and his people returned to Jerusalem. If you read just 2 Samuel 12, 26 through 31 out of context, it reads much like the rest of David's life reads, especially if you read the first 8-9 chapters of 2 Samuel. It reads like one of his wartime memoirs. Because here is David going to capture a city. He goes and he captures it, he takes the throne or the crown, puts it on his head, and he moves on. But 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 26 through 31 is most notable when you put it in the context of what's happening, because David has committed the gross sin with immorality in chapter 11. He loses his son in chapter 12 and has the punishment, but he has the fortitude at the end of this chapter to move on with his life. Ironically, he does at the end of chapter 12 what he should have done at the beginning of chapter 11. Instead of sitting there and walking around on the roof of his house when kings were out to war, he should have been out there with his men. And I would argue, too, that David, at this point in time, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 26 through 31, understands that. And he's willing to move on past it because he knows the only thing you can do is push forward. I know there may be people here this morning that I'm talking to who have gone through a really horrible period of their life, or maybe they're going through a certain period of their life that's just absolutely terrible. And one of the things I was told very early when I started preaching was, preach to broken hearts. Because there's one on every pew. And so I know that there's probably a couple people here, and I don't have exact names in case Kyle's going to ask me afterwards. I don't know exactly. But I would imagine that there are people here this morning who are struggling with this. Who are struggling with things that are almost suffocating in their sorrow or suffocating in their grief. And I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that there is hope. That life does indeed move on. But life indeed ultimately moves on to heaven. And so I don't ask you to ignore the grief. I don't ask you to just act like it never happened. I ask you to not let it paralyze you. I've let it paralyze me. I know other people have let it paralyze them. But the only thing we can do is continue moving on towards heaven and ultimately towards our goal of salvation. And if you're here this morning, what you may be suffering from, what you may be guilt-ridden from, is the fact that God sees all your sins. He knows where you're wrong. And it's hard to move past that guilt. I'm here to tell you, He'll forgive you of every last one of those things. If we would bow the knee to Him, worship Him,